The sun crept across the blue sky, filling the park with soft golden light. A light breeze ruffled the leaves of the old oaks, and the smell of fresh barbecue wafted lazily along the paths, mingling with the sounds of laughter, cheerful shouts, and the rustle of balls hitting the grass. Everything seemed serene, perfect, as if the day had been a gift. Jeremy, a 16-year-old with a wide smile and bright eyes, was racing a ball with friends near where his family was having a picnic. His laughter blended with the noise of the park like part of a living landscape. He was carefree, almost happy, at least in this moment. Nearby, at a table with a white and red tablecloth, his mother, Cassandra, was lovingly arranging the home-cooked meals. She was double-checking everything, as she always did, to make sure everyone had enough food. "Jeremy will still say I didn't cook enough," she grumbled, smiling. Jeremy's father, Michael, sat in a folding chair a little farther away. His face seemed relaxed, but there was the usual wariness in his eyes, the kind that stays with a man when he's used to being on guard. He was watching his son, the people around him, the whole park, as if scanning the surroundings. Michael had always been like that. No one in the family knew exactly what he did, but it was clear to everyone that his job required more than just the ability to wear a suit. Everything was going perfectly, as it should have been. But suddenly, a slight breeze carried something else, not the smell of food or laughter, but the low rumble of a tense conversation. Michael tensed slightly, his gaze sharpening a little. Somewhere in the distance an argument had begun, something too loud for the serene day. He noted it, but decided not to disturb himself and his family, yet. Jeremy, meanwhile, tired of the game, walked over to the table and grabbed a can of Coke. He waved at his dad, smiling. "Hey, Dad, aren't you sitting a little too relaxed? Why don't you come play ball with us?" Michael grinned, pitching forward a little. "You'll only catch me in nightmares, son. Beat your friends first." But even in that brief moment, Michael felt something change. His gaze fell on a man in uniform walking through the park. The policeman, tall, with rough facial features, stopped at a neighboring company. His voice cut through the noise of the park, rough, demanding. The words were unintelligible, but the tone remained recognizable. Michael tensed instinctively. Something was wrong. "Is something wrong?" Cassandra asked, noticing her husband's gaze clouded over. "No," Michael answered briefly, but his voice sounded more hoarse than he wanted it to. He knew the feeling, the same one he had before dangerous missions. His intuition told him that this harmless morning was about to turn into something else entirely. Michael kept his eyes on the policeman. He noticed him walking around the other groups of vacationers, his heavy gait and frown standing out against the lightness and carelessness around him. People averted their eyes as if trying to become invisible, but the officer was obviously not going to leave just like that. His figure, tall and heavy, seemed to carry a threat in itself. Jeremy, sitting at the table eating a chicken wing, didn't notice anything. "You're not going to believe this, Mom. I almost beat Lucas at soccer," he blurted out with his mouth full, waving his arms. But Cassandra wasn't listening. Her gaze fell on Michael, who was tense as a taut string. The policeman stopped. He was only a few meters from their table. His gaze traveled through the company. Father, mother, teenager, a couple of friends nearby. The officer's eyes lingered on Jeremy, then on Michael. His face contorted into a slight grimace, as if he'd decided something for himself. "Good afternoon," he spoke, but there was no goodwill in his voice. He stepped closer, one hand on his belt where his baton hung. "Afternoon," Michael replied calmly, though his insides clenched. He stood up so that he was level with the officer. "Is this your family?" the policeman asked, glancing at Cassandra and Jeremy. His tone was neutral, but there was a sense of wariness in it. "Yeah, is something wrong?" Michael spoke evenly, but there was an undercurrent of steel in his voice. "Got a complaint," the officer finally said, taking a step closer. His fingers nervously touched the baton. "Someone said it's noisy in here and that some people are disturbing the peace. Is that what you do for fun here?" Cassandra looked at Michael perplexed, and Jeremy frowned. "What's the complaint? We're just sitting at the table." Michael's voice remained calm, but with each word the tension grew. The policeman smiled, but there was no warmth in his smile. "A lot of people complain. It's too noisy. Oh, and—" he shifted his gaze to Jeremy again. "Your guy's a little too loud for something. It raises questions." Jeremy looked up. What did I do? What did I do?" His voice sounded confused, but already resentment was starting to build in it. "Let's not make trouble, son," the policeman cut off, looking directly at the teenager. His tone changed abruptly from polite to threatening. Michael took a step forward, now standing quite close to the officer. "Look, officer, we're not breaking the law. We're just a family vacationing in the park. If you want to press charges, give us specific reasons. Otherwise, please let us enjoy our day." The policeman squinted. His eyes glittered with malice, like a predator smelling prey. He didn't like to have his authority questioned. "I decide who is the troublemaker here," he said slowly, his voice dripping with venom. He took another step forward, now almost close to Michael. Jeremy stood up, trying to defend his father. "We didn't do anything. Why are you bothering us?" he shouted out. And that was the beginning of the end. The policeman turned sharply toward Jeremy, his hand instantly reaching for his baton. "What are you arguing about?" His voice rumbled over the park, drawing the attention of the others. Cassandra gasped, trying to calm her son. Michael, not taking his eyes off the officer, slowly raised his hand as if to call for silence. "Officer," his voice sounded steady, but there was a threat in it. "Take your hand off the baton. Now." Everything froze. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. The people around them froze, watching the collision, which could at any moment turn into something terrible. The policeman slowly withdrew his hand, but his look promised trouble. Michael felt the first shadow being pulled. It was only the first act of a tragedy he couldn't prevent. Before we continue with our story, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether something similar has happened to you or your loved ones. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapters. And now, back to our story. The policeman froze, looking at Jeremy as if he were looking at a dangerous criminal, not a teenager with a can of Coke in his hands. His gaze slid over the boy, assessing every detail. The t-shirt with the basketball team logo, the old sneakers, the chain around his neck. He took a step forward, as if he wanted to stand over Jeremy, dominating him. "What are you hanging around for?" he asked sharply, ignoring Michael and Cassandra's presence. "Why are you so nervous, huh? Hiding something?" Jeremy frowned, trying to figure out what the man was talking about. I'm just with my family. We're on vacation," he replied, trying to sound respectful, but his voice trembled slightly. The policeman grinned, leaning a little closer. "By the family? Of course. And these friends of yours." He nodded toward the boys who were still standing nearby, looking confused at what was happening. "With you too? Or are you here to, Arranged something wrong? What's wrong? Jeremy looked at him with wide-open eyes. I didn't do anything. We were just playing soccer. Oh, sure. Just playing around. The officer extended wryly, his hand moving to his baton again, but he didn't pull it out yet. And for some reason everyone's complaining about the noise, and you're standing there like you're an innocent little angel. Michael stepped closer, his voice sounding low but firm. Officer, my son didn't do anything. If you have specific complaints, you can voice them to me. The policeman ignored his father. His eyes narrowed and he continued to look only at Jeremy. Are you always this loud, boy? Or is it just in the park that you like to draw attention to yourself? Maybe it's your style to be trouble everywhere you go. Jeremy, who had been trying to hold back until then, felt anger rising in his chest. Why are you talking to me like that? I haven't done anything wrong. You don't even know me. His voice grew louder, almost shaking with resentment. Jeremy, don't, Cassandra quickly put in, her voice sounding pleading. She grabbed her son's arm, but he pulled away. No, Mother. Why do I have to keep quiet? He's accusing me of all kinds of nonsense just because I'm black, Jeremy shouted, clenching his fists. The policeman straightened up, his face hard. Oh, that's how it is. The racism game, huh? Look, kid, if anyone's causing trouble around here, it's you. And let's not play victim. I see people like you every day. You think you can do whatever you want, and then yell racism when you get caught. The policeman's words hit the whole family. Cassandra clutched her chest, her eyes filling with tears. Michael stood motionless, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles turned white. I'm asking you to stop, Michael said quietly but threateningly. His voice sounded like the thunderclap before the storm, but the officer ignored him. Now, let's turn your pockets out, kid. I'm sure you've got something interesting. Drugs, maybe? Or maybe guns. Guys like you always have something. The crowd around them began to stop. People who a moment ago had been minding their own business were now looking at what was happening with apprehension. But no one dared to interfere. Jeremy gasped with indignation. You can't do that. I don't have anything. Why are you treating me like this? Michael took a step forward and stopped right between the policeman and his son. That's enough. One more word and I'll file a complaint. You're exceeding your authority. The policeman grinned in a contemptuous smirk. A complaint? Oh, sure. You think your complaints mean anything? He slowly reached for the walkie-talkie. Let's see what my colleagues think. The tension hung in the air like a taut cable, ready to snap at any moment. Michael stood like a stone wall, protecting his son. In that moment, he knew that the situation could spiral out of control at any second. And though Jeremy wanted to say something else, his father's gaze stopped him. All that was left was to watch this day, which had begun with sunshine and laughter, turn into a storm where his family became a target for injustice and hatred. It happened so fast that Jeremy didn't even realize what was happening. The policeman suddenly grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with such force that he cried out in pain. Jeremy tried to pull away, but the grip was ironclad. What? You decided to play the hero, boy, growled the policeman, shoving the teenager to the ground. His voice was cold, soaked with contempt. Let me go, Jeremy shouted, trying to stay on his feet. But the policeman used his advantage in weight and strength to push him so that he fell with his knees on the hard ground, hitting his hands on the rough gravel. Jeremy, Cassandra shouted, lunging forward, but the policeman put his hand out, stopping her. Stay back. This is an official detention, he barked, not even glancing in her direction. What are you holding him for? What has he done?" She shouted hysterically, trying to make her way to her son. Her voice shook with fear and anger, but the officer proceeded as if she didn't exist. "Stop this right now," Michael intervened, taking a step forward, but the officer snatched his baton and pointed it at him. "One more step and I'll arrest you too, understand?" The policeman's eyes burned with menace. "It's a child. You're breaking his arm." Michael's voice was breaking into a shout, but he knew that another second and the situation would become uncontrollable. Jeremy was trying to breathe at this point, but his face was pressed to the ground and the pain in his wrist was becoming unbearable. "I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything," he wheezed, fighting panic. "Sure, nothing." The policeman smirked sarcastically, leaning in close to the teenager's ear. "That's what you all say. And then, you know what we find? Drugs, or stolen stuff, or something worse. And guess what, kid? Nobody's gonna believe you." The words echoed in Jeremy's head. His face burned with humiliation, and tears of impotent rage mingled with the dust on the ground. Cassandra continued to yell, "Somebody! Help! He's killing my son!" But the people around them only looked away. Those who were closer stepped back, heads down, as if they were trying to convince themselves that it was none of their business. "Why are you silent?" she shouted, looking at the crowd, but no one even looked her in the eye. Michael, seeing that no one was going to intervene, clenched his fists so hard that his nails dug into his palms. He took another step toward the cop, knowing this could end badly, but his father's instinct screamed that he couldn't just stand there and watch. "Enough! You are exceeding your authority." His voice sounded like a thunderclap, drawing the attention of even those who tried to leave. The cop slowly raised his head, still pinning Jeremy to the ground. "What are you? The big hero? You think I can't deal with you too? Please give me a reason." "You already got him when you attacked my son." Michael spoke evenly, but inside he was torn with rage. "Let him go. Now." The policeman paused for a moment, assessing the situation. He had clearly not expected such resistance. Usually, such scenes ended with a broken family and his complete victory. But this man, his confident tone, his burning gaze, did not look frightened. "Well, let's see how you talk when I call for backup," the officer threw in, pulling out his radio. Michael took another step closer, his voice even lower and colder. "Do you wish to explain your behavior to your superiors? I wouldn't advise you to. You've already gone too far." The crowd began to whisper. People were looking at each other, some of them pulling out their phones to take pictures of what was happening. Michael noticed it out of the corner of his eye. This was his chance. "Look around," he said loudly, addressing both the policemen and all the witnesses. "You all see what's going on here. This is not a detention. This is an assault. This is brutality and abuse of power." The policeman looked around, noticing the phones for the first time. His face twitched for a moment, but he quickly returned to his role. "Step back, or you're going to follow that boy." But something in Michael's voice, a cold threat, an undercurrent of power made him hesitate. He froze, as if hesitating about what to do next. Jeremy was finally able to lift his head. His eyes were full of pain and anger. He looked up at his father and whispered softly, "Dad, please, do something." Michael realized at that moment that he couldn't wait any longer. Everything that would happen next would depend only on him. The cop stood over Jeremy like a predator that had just cornered its prey. His hand was still clutching the walkie-talkie, but he clearly wasn't going to call for backup. This was personal. He looked at Jeremy with a contempt that was impossible to ignore. "Look at him," he said loudly, addressing the crowd. His voice broke the silence like the blow of a whip. "This is your future if we don't keep such as this in check. A little rebel who thinks he can do whatever he wants." Jeremy, his face still pressed to the ground, raised his head. His eyes met the policeman's, full of anger and hatred. "I didn't do anything," he said, trying to make his voice sound firm, but the pain in his wrist, twisted behind his back, was unbearable. "Oh, of course you didn't do anything," the policeman continued sarcastically. "You were just out for a walk, right? Just enjoying the day. That's what you all say. But we know how it ends. First you make noise in the parks, then you rob stores, and then—" He paused, his gaze blazing with hatred. "Then we find you in the news reports. But I won't let that happen." "Stop it! That's racist! You have no right to say that!" Cassandra shouted, but her words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd. "Racism?" The cop glanced at her and smirked. "Of course it is. You always say that when you get caught. It's your favorite excuse." The crowd around them froze. People watched, some whispered, but no one intervened. The phone cameras kept filming, but their owners remained at a distance, afraid to take a step forward. "Get up!" the officer shouted sharply, yanking Jeremy's arm. The teenager shrieked, but obeyed. He tried to get up, but the officer pushed him back down, forcing him to his knees again. "Are you slow?" he growled. "You can't even stand. Maybe you don't belong in a park, but in a cage." The words hit Jeremy in the face. He raised his head again, his gaze full of anger and humiliation. "I'm a human being like you," he said quietly but firmly. The policeman chuckled. "A man? You? Really? Look at you, boy. You're just—" He paused again, looking directly into Jeremy's eyes. "Just another one like the rest of them. A problem. And you know what? Problems need to be solved." Michael stepped forward. His voice was low and threatening. "One more word, and you'll regret it." The policeman turned his head toward Michael. "Ah, there you go, Daddy. You think you can threaten me? You think your words mean anything? You're just like him, only older. Just another problem." Michael clenched his fists, his gaze so cold it felt like even the air around him was freezing. But he knew that if he made a single wrong move, it could end in disaster. Meanwhile, Jeremy tried to get up again. He rose slowly to his feet, trying to maintain his dignity. But the policeman would not tolerate it. "Hold still," he shouted, pushing Jeremy so hard that he fell again. The crowd gasped, but no one moved. "Why are you doing this?" Jeremy wheezed, lying on the ground. His voice was full of despair. "Because I can," the policeman replied, his face as cold as stone. Cassandra cried, her cry echoing through the park. "Somebody help!" "Please." But the park remained indifferent. People averted their eyes, some quietly said, "It's none of our business." Michael, seeing that no one was going to interfere, took a deep breath. He knew it was time. His family was on the brink of destruction and he couldn't let it go on any longer. Something switched inside him. It wasn't just anger or resentment. It was a decision. He would not wait. His voice sounded calm but threatening. "You've crossed the line. This is your last mistake." The policeman turned around but didn't have time to answer. Michael's gaze spoke for him. The storm was just beginning. Michael took a slow step forward. His face, normally calm and reserved, was now like an icy mask. Every muscle in his body tensed, but his movements remained measured, almost frighteningly slow. The policeman, still standing over Jeremy, noticed this and turned sharply. "Hey, stay where you are," the officer shouted, pulling his baton from his holster. His voice sounded confident, but there was something in his eyes that betrays all those who are used to abusing power. The fear of encountering someone who is not afraid. Michael stopped 2 feet away, arms crossed over his chest. His gaze was as cold as a winter night. It was the look of a man who not only knew what to do, but had already decided what he was going to do. "You've already gone too far," he said quietly, but his voice sounded like it overrode all the noises in the park. "Let my son go. Now." The policeman grinned, but his confidence was a visible mask. He pointed the baton at Michael, holding it with both hands. "Are you giving me orders? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Michael squinted, and there was something dangerous in his eyes. "Wrong. You're the one who has no idea who you're dealing with." The crowd around them froze. Someone whispered, "What is he doing? Is he crazy?" People craned their necks to get a better look. Jeremy, still lying on the ground, looked up at his father. His lips were trembling and his eyes were filled with tears of pain and humiliation. "Daddy, don't," he said hoarsely. Michael cast a brief glance at him. "Jeremy, don't move. It's going to be okay." The policeman snorted, taking a step forward. "You think I'm afraid of you, old man? One more step, and you'll find yourself next to that petty criminal in handcuffs." Michael moved forward again, and this time his steps were quick and purposeful. In an instant, he was within arm's length of the officer. "What are you?" the policeman began, but Michael, moving with a precision that could only be the result of years of training, grabbed his baton hand. In one smooth motion, he twisted it, causing the officer to drop the weapon. The baton fell to the ground with a thud. The crowd gasped. People couldn't believe their eyes. "What the? You assaulted a cop?" shouted the officer, trying to pull out his walkie-talkie. But Michael had already grabbed him by the collar, pulling him to him. "You thought you could humiliate my son, ruin his life, and get away with it," Michael said. His voice was cold, but you could hear the danger in it. "Did you think I was just going to watch? You don't realize who you're messing with." The policeman tried to free himself, but Michael held him so tightly it looked pointless. "I'll report you to your superiors. You're going to pay for this," shouted the officer, his voice no longer sounding confident. "Pay up?" Michael leaned closer, his voice even quieter, but now there was a threat in it. "You have no idea what it means to pay. You're used to impunity. You think your uniform makes you untouchable. But I've seen your kind in every corner of the world. I know how you work, and you know what? I always win." The policeman turned pale. "You? Who the hell are you?" Michael let go of him and the officer recoiled, rubbing his neck. Michael took a step back and slowly pulled a small leather pouch from his pocket. He opened it, revealing a gold badge. "Who am I?" he repeated. "I am the one you fear most, because I see your filth, and I won't let it go without consequences." The policeman froze, staring at the badge. His face turned white, and the hand that had reached for the radio stopped. Michael turned to the crowd, his voice louder. "You all saw what happened here. You saw how he overstepped his authority, how he humiliated my son, how he tried to use force to break us. Now you have a choice. Stay silent or finally tell the truth." People began to whisper. Some were still standing still, but a few stepped forward confidently, camera phones in hand. Cassandra, who had been crying the whole time, rushed over to Jeremy and helped him up. She hugged him, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Michael took a step back, keeping his eyes on the officer. "Turn yourself in, right now, or the consequences will be in ways you can't even imagine." The policeman stood motionless, his gaze darting between Michael and the crowd, which began to whisper louder and louder. He realized he had lost. Before we continue, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and if something similar has happened to you or your loved ones. Subscribe so you don't miss the sequel and other exciting stories. And now we continue. Michael stood motionless, watching the policeman, still full of anger, trying to find the strength to attack again. He was confident, but now visibly embarrassed and worried. Michael, as if reading his mind, slowly removed his coat, folding it neatly on one of the nearby chairs, keeping his eyes on the officer. His face remained cold, and his body seemed tense to the max. He was in no hurry. He knew he had time. He knew his moment had not yet arrived. "Are you sure you want to continue, officer?" His voice was firm, almost aloof. "You seem to realize that things may not go your way from here." He didn't say a word about his true profession, but it was obvious. His voice was too confident, too experienced for an ordinary citizen. And now, as he stood before this policeman, all his experience of a life in danger was ready to be revealed. The policeman stared at him, losing confidence. His hand was already reaching for his radio, but it stopped in midair when Michael suddenly took a step forward. It wasn't just a decisive step. It was quick, like a lightning strike. Before the policeman could realize what was happening, Michael grabbed his hand holding his wrist and twisted it sharply, using a force that a normal man would not have been able to use in such a situation. With a crunch of bone, the cop tried to pull away, but Michael wouldn't let go. He moved smoothly but ruthlessly, knowing exactly how to neutralize the threat. "Hold still," Michael muttered, almost calmly. This was the moment when the one who had once been a victim became a force. He squeezed the policeman's hand so hard that he cried out in pain. The fingers that had held the baton a second ago were now in painful spasms. The crowd, which until then had been standing aside as if mesmerized, began to move. People's eyes began to fill with admiration, and the first bold voices began to sound among them. "Look, he's right," shouted one of the men standing nearby. "He's just protecting his family," exclaimed a woman filming the whole thing on her phone. The policeman, sensing that Michael was not going to let him go, began to resist, but his every gesture was met with a fierce rebuff. He shouted threats, but his voice no longer sounded confident. The force Michael was using on him left no chance of victory. "You have no idea how wrong you were," Michael continued, not letting go of the cop. His gaze was icy, and every word felt like a blow. The policeman, in pain and humiliation, began to give up. He growled, trying to free himself, but it was in vain. He was caught in a trap he had set himself. The crowd continued to watch. Applause began to sound, and the first brave voices began to cheer Michael on. There was a tension in the air that seemed almost palpable. The moment Michael looked at the policeman once more, his face changed. He was ready to see this through, but there was more than rage in his eyes. There was compassion. Compassion for his son, for how much he'd been humiliated, and for the pain he'd endured watching that humiliation. "You will not threaten my family again," Michael said, softly but firmly. His voice was calm, but full of a strength that could sweep away everything around him. The policeman, unable to bear the strain, began to back away, realizing that he had lost. He glanced once more at the crowd, trying to regain some dignity, But all his attempts were in vain. The people around him now looked at him with contempt. At this moment, Jeremy, who had been sitting on the ground all this time, rose to his feet. His body was still shaking from the stress, but his gaze was steady. He walked toward his father, his steps slow but sure. He lifted his head, and for the first time all day, Michael saw not only pain, but determination in his eyes. "Daddy," Jeremy said quietly. His voice was full of gratitude and love, but there was something else in his eyes, a fire that lit up where there had once been only weakness. "You protected me. I'm proud of you." Michael smiled, his face softening. He took a step toward his son and hugged him. It wasn't just a hug, it was an acknowledgement that they had been through the unbearable and survived. They weren't just family now. They were a unit capable of fighting any injustice. But the policeman was still standing, leaning on one leg with pain and humiliation he couldn't hide. Michael knew that this battle was not yet over, but in that moment they had won. And that was all that mattered. "It's time to go," Michael said, keeping his eyes on the policeman. He knew that their family's life would not be the same today. But there was only one question in his heart. Was he ready to face the consequences of his determination? Michael took Jeremy aside, helping him to sit on the bench. His hands trembled slightly as he checked to see if his son was all right. Cassandra immediately sank down beside him, wrapping her arms around them both. Her face was wet with tears, but there was a hardness in her eyes. She was no longer crying tears of fear. Now they were tears of anger and powerlessness. "Dad, Jeremy began, but his voice broke off. He felt like everything inside him had broken. He sat with his palms pressed against his knees, looking at the ground as if he was afraid to meet anyone's eyes. "I couldn't do anything. You didn't have to do anything, son," Michael replied softly, covering his hand with his own. His voice was quiet but firm. "He's the one who made the choice. It's not your fault." Meanwhile, the policeman staggered to his feet. He held onto his wrist, which was still sore from Michael's capture, and cast angry glances at his family and at the crowd, which was now filming everything openly. His face was burning with humiliation, and he knew that this day could be the beginning of the end of his career. "You think you've won?" he wheezed, barely containing his rage. "You don't know who you're messing with. My team, my people. We'll straighten this out. This video means nothing." Michael turned around slowly, his gaze once again icy. "You really think so?" He took a step forward, and even in his humiliated pose, the policeman took a step back, as if sensing that the man before him was not just a man, but a force that could not be argued with. "You've lived too long, thinking that no one could handle you," Michael continued, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "But you forgot one important thing. Any system, no matter how corrupt, can collapse if someone decides to pull the right levers. And I know where to push." The policeman froze, his face pale. Are you threatening me?" he said, trying to retain some dignity. Michael leaned closer. His voice had become almost a whisper, but that made it sound even more threatening. "It's not a threat. It's a promise." The crowd around them froze. Some of those who had shot the video had already started posting the footage on social media. Muffled sounds of messages, calls, discussions could be heard. People no longer averted their eyes like they used to. They saw how someone who had always been privileged was on the verge of being exposed. A few hours later, when the family returned home, Michael sat down at his laptop. His face remained somber. He couldn't let go of this incident. Everything inside him was screaming that this wasn't just a random episode. This officer had acted like it wasn't the first time he'd done this, and Michael's intuition, honed by years in the Secret Service, told him it was true. Michael dialed the number of his old co-worker. "Hey, Frank, I need some help. Give me access to the database. I need to find out something about an officer." Frank, on the other end of the wire, grinned. "Are you on the hunt again, Michael? Who is it this time?" "The name is Paul Hudson, a cop from this town. I want every record of his cases, anything you can find." It wasn't more than an hour before Frank called back. You could hear the surprise in his voice. "Michael, you're not going to believe this. This guy is a real time mine. He's had 7 complaints filed against him in the last 2 years, all for abuse of authority. But you know what's interesting? Not one of them has ever gone to trial." Michael frowned, his jaw clenched. "Why?" "Connections, Michael. His father was a police captain and his uncle was in the Justice Department. All the cases were dismissed in the early stages. People complained about his aggression, his racist remarks, but it all sank into the paperwork." Michael sighed heavily, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair tightly. It wasn't a surprise, but it didn't make it any easier. He realized that Hudson was used to living without consequences, confident in his impunity. "There's more," Frank continued. "Last week he was involved in an assault case against another teenager. That boy ended up in the hospital with a fractured rib. The family filed a complaint, but the case was dismissed due to lack of evidence." Those words sounded like a blow to Michael. He felt everything inside him boil. The image of Jeremy, humiliated, terrified, lying on the ground under the weight of that officer, was before his eyes, and he knew that if he didn't, no one would stop this man. He rose from his chair, his movements quick and purposeful. "Thank you, Frank. You just gave me everything I need." Frank laughed softly. "Be careful out there, Michael. You've always been too stubborn." "It's not stubbornness, Frank," Michael replied, his voice sounding like a promise. "It's justice." The next day, Paul Hudson's name filled the news feeds. Videos taken in the park went viral all over the internet. People began to share their stories of his cruelty, how he humiliated and intimidated them. Every comment, every story was another blow to his career. Michael sat next to Jeremy, holding his hand. His son finally looked up at his father. "Daddy, why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. Michael looked him in the eye. "Because no one should ever have to go through what you went through again. Ever." The morning began with a silence that seemed too loud. The family sat around the kitchen table, but none of them had touched their breakfast. Jeremy was twirling a spoon in his hands, unable to look up. Cassandra sat across from him, leaning on her arms and looking at her husband. Michael looked focused as always, but there was something in his eyes that the family had almost never seen before. Worry. Michael's phone was on the table, bursting with notifications. Every minute, new messages, calls, letters came in. Journalists, activists, strangers. It seemed as if the whole world had suddenly decided to pay attention to their family. It seemed like a triumph, but Michael knew it was only the beginning. "We've hit the floodlights," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and strained. "And it's not just good news." Cassandra frowned. "What you mean?" Michael raised his eyes to her. "You know how this system works. Paul Hudson isn't just a bad cop. He's part of a bigger machine. And now that we've started rocking that machine, they're going to want to stop us." Jeremy quietly put the spoon down on the table. His voice was weak but firm. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Michael looked at his son, and his heart clenched. He could see the fear in his eyes, the fear he tried to hide behind a manly expression. "I think we have to be ready for anything," he answered honestly. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud knock on the door. All three of them froze. Michael rose slowly, gesturing for Cassandra and Jeremy to stay where they were. He walked to the door, peering through the peephole. "It's the police," he said dryly, turning back to the family. Cassandra turned pale. "Have they started yet?" "Don't worry." Michael took a deep breath and opened the door. Two uniformed men stood on the threshold. Their faces were serious and their eyes were cold. "Mr. Johnson?" one of them asked. Michael nodded, gripping the door tightly. "What do you want?" "We're here about the incident yesterday," the officer continued. "You and your family are featured in the investigation. We would like to ask you some questions." Michael remained standing on the threshold, blocking their passage. "Are you investigating what your colleague did, or is this an attempt to silence us?" The officers exchanged glances. The second, younger one stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, we just want to clear up some details. This is standard procedure." Michael squinted his eyes. "I'm not sure you have standard procedures for defending uniformed criminals, but I won't say a word without a lawyer. If you have a warrant, show it. If not, you can leave." The officers froze for a moment, but then slowly backed away. The first one cast a brief glance over Michael's shoulder to where Cassandra and Jeremy were sitting at the table. His gaze lingered on the boy a little longer than it should have, and Michael noticed it. "We'll be back," he said before turning around and walking away. Michael closed the door and turned to his family. "It started," he said briefly. Jeremy twitched his shoulder nervously. Why were they looking at me like that? Like I did something wrong? Michael walked over to his son and put his hand on his shoulder. "Because you're a symbol to them, a symbol that their system can be broken. They're afraid of you, Jeremy, not because you did anything bad, but because you survived." Cassandra clenched her hands on the table. "Michael, this is too much. They could come again, or worse. What if they start threatening us? What if they try to do it discreetly?" "I know it's possible," Michael said quietly. "That's why I'm going to do everything I can to make sure they don't have power over us anymore." Later that night, as the house fell into silence, Michael turned on his laptop and began working. He contacted the journalists who had already posted the video, providing them with new evidence of Hudson's sordid past. He sent requests to his colleagues in the intelligence services to see if Hudson had any connections in the criminal world. Each new detail added more horror to the picture. It turned out that Hudson had not only been hiding behind the backs of his superiors, but had been involved in covering up crimes committed by his colleagues on multiple occasions. He was part of a system that had been breaking the lives of people like Jeremy for years. Cassandra sat next to her, watching her husband. "Do you think this will help?" Michael stopped and looked at her. "It won't bring us back our peace of mind, but it will make them afraid. Afraid that their secrets will no longer be secrets." There was silence outside their window, but Michael knew it was the calm before the storm. He knew the system would begin to defend itself. They would try to discredit him, put pressure on his family, do anything to silence him. But he also knew that the truth was a weapon, and he was prepared to use it to the end. The next morning, when the family left the house, they saw that someone had written in paint on the sidewalk, "Shut up or go away." Cassandra gasped. Jeremy clamped his hands over his mouth, and Michael only clenched his fists tighter. "They want to scare us," he said quietly. "But this just proves we're on the right track." Jeremy looked at his father. His voice trembled, but there was something new in it. Determination. "I'm not afraid. I won't let them humiliate us anymore." Michael nodded, and there was a spark of pride in his eyes. "Then hang in there, son, because we're just getting started." The family entered the house, quietly, as if each step gave away the heaviness in their hearts. The day had been long, painful, filled with both small victories and new threats. But now they were home, behind closed doors. Their sanctuary, which had seemed safe before, now resembled a fortress besieged by an invisible enemy. The first thing Cassandra did was go to the window and close the curtains, as if she wanted to shut out the world. Her hands were shaking, but she tried not to show it. Jeremy sat down on the couch, hunched over as if the weight of the day had pinned him to the ground. He ran his hand over his face and looked at his father. "Dad," he finally said, breaking the silence that hung in the room. His voice sounded tired, but there was a pain in it that was hard to describe. Why did all this happen? Why do we have to live like this? Why are we hated just for who we are?" Michael stopped in the doorway of the living room, took off his coat, and hung it on a chair. He looked at his son, and for a moment there was an unbearable heaviness in his eyes. They were not just the eyes of a father, they were the eyes of a man who had seen injustice too long and endured it too many times. He sat down next to Jeremy and put his arm around his shoulders. "Son, I wish I could tell you that things will get better, that tomorrow everything will change and you won't have to face this kind of thing anymore, but that would be a lie." Jeremy looked at his father. "Then why? Why did we start this? We only made it worse. They're after us now. They want to silence us. We didn't win." Michael sighed, his voice softer, but every phrase he spoke sounded like a weighty statement. "You see, Jeremy, fighting for justice isn't a moment. It's a process. It's a war that sometimes lasts years, decades, generations. And sometimes those who start this fight never see the end of it. We didn't start it for ourselves. We started it for those who will come after us. For the sake of someone else your age not lying on the ground under the foot of someone who thinks they're better." Jeremy gritted his teeth, his gaze falling to the floor again. He wanted to say something, but the words were stuck somewhere deep inside. Cassandra walked over to them, sat down next to them, and took her son's hand. "You were brave, Jeremy. You endured what would have broken many. We are proud of you, but we also realize how hard it is." "It's more than hard, Mom," he exhaled. "I felt like a nobody. They looked at me like I was trash, like I wasn't human." Those words made her clam up, holding back tears. She knew her son wasn't exaggerating. Michael put his hand on Jeremy's shoulder. "You're a human being. Don't ever forget that. And you know what the most important thing is? You proved it today, not only to them, but to yourself. They tried to break you, but you didn't let them." Jeremy looked at his father, and his eyes glistened with the tears he was desperately trying to hold back. "But what's the point of this if it all continues? If there's another one like Hudson tomorrow?" Michael squeezed his shoulder a little tighter. "The point is, today you let the world see the truth. You made them realize that men like Hudson can no longer act with impunity. And you know what else is important. Every person who saw that video, every person who read about it now knows that you fought. They know that we didn't stay silent. That's a start." Cassandra added quietly, "You are not alone, Jeremy. There are those who support us. We can't let them take our dignity away from us." Silence filled the room again, but this time it was different. It was not the overwhelming silence of fear, but the silence of reflection. The family sat together as one, drawing strength from each other. The next morning, when Jeremy woke up, he heard his father talking on the phone. Michael was sitting at the table, his voice low but confident. "I'm ready to go all the way. This isn't just an issue of my son. It's a matter of a system that has hidden people like Hudson for too long. We'll go all the way to trial if we have to." When the conversation was over, Jeremy walked over to his father. He looked at him, now with a new sense of respect and understanding. "Dad," he began, "I don't know what comes next, but I'm ready to fight alongside you." Michael smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in that smile. He knew that they would face hardships many more times, but he also knew that their family had grown stronger. "Then hang in there, son," he said quietly. "This fight requires sacrifice, but I promise you it will be worth it." A sense of inevitability hung in the air. It was not a final victory, but it was a step forward. Their story was no longer just a story of humiliation and fear. It was a story of resistance, a story of a family that didn't break no matter what. And somewhere deep inside, Jeremy felt that he was no longer the boy who had fallen to the ground in the face of hate. He was now part of something bigger, something that could change the world. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced injustice or racism in your life? Your opinion is very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us and our stories. Write the phrase, "The fight for justice continues," in the comments, so we know you're listening to us all the way to the end. We wish you a good day and justice in every moment of your life.